Our next speaker will be talking about the blurring of border. He's the director of Cypol and the past director of cybercrime at the INTERPOL. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hand together for Craig Jones.
Good morning, everybody. It's nice to be back on the stage again, where I get to do a bit of speaking today. I'm going to keep it simple. We've heard a lot about technical conversation. There's a lot of technologists here. I am technical to a degree, but actually, I joined policing in 1990. So I followed, when I started in policing, we sat around the table, we got our briefing on pieces of paper, and we ripped the corner off when the job was done. What could go wrong? Fast forward to where we are now. I used to police in a local context. I used to walk the streets. I used to speak to the people. And we had different sectors and areas we worked in. And we wouldn't go into those different sectors or areas unless we had a different job there or we were called to assistance. If you expand that out now, and this is the presentation, is about that blurring of borders. Where do the borders exist for policing? Because if I hear someone say again that cybercrime is borderless, I will bang my head on the floor again, because for law enforcement, for nations, we are constrained by our borders and the way that we can operate as law enforcement. So when we look at law enforcement, how would that operate? Well, Interpol was a fairly resilient organization. Over 100 years old. It has 196 member countries. We have an office in every single country. So every law enforcement agency in every country contributes to a national central bureau. And here, it's in Riyadh. We also have regional bureaus. Now, regional bureaus allow us to place our staff, so Interpol staff go into the regional bureaus. Interpol's made up of seconded officials, as I was. I was a senior officer in the National Crime Agency in the United Kingdom, responsible at the time when I was seconded in for leading all of the UK's law enforcement efforts in preparing for cybercrime. So making sure law enforcement officials have the tools, the techniques, the skills that they needed to investigate cybercrime. So at Interpol, we have seconded officers such as me, we have contract staff, and our headquarters in Lyon in France. Now, this for me is quite an interesting piece around the border side of things. Lyon in France, a very Western organization and country, you could say, because normally organizations follow a culture, and where most of the people are from, it follows the culture from that country. And I'll make some more observations on that in a moment. So 196 countries, we're connected with secure platforms and networks. We can share data and information really quickly. As I said, I led the global cybercrime program, and when I went in, we came up with this: reducing the global impact of cybercrime and protecting communities for a safer world. Law enforcement's role is to protect their communities. It's to make sure that people are safe in their communities and to prevent crime. So taking that out into a global context, we talked about reducing the global impact. Reducing. We're not saying we're going to stop it, because we haven't stopped crime in the physical sense. So in terms of the online sense, crime is always going to be there. So let's talk about reducing it. Let's talk about how we can protect our communities on a global, regional, and national basis. So again, we've got to look at this through a number of different lenses, effectively, when we're working. So it's sort of divided up into four areas, Interpol. We have our Americas regional area, we have our Europe region area, we have our Africa, and then also we have Asia and South Pacific. But we also have an interesting one. We have sort of almost an unofficial group, the MENA group, Middle East, North Africa. And the chiefs of police just had their meeting in Lyon a few weeks ago. And when you sit down and listen to those chiefs of police from those countries, and they're discussing the challenges, the real issues they have policing in their different regions and their countries, you can see actually, and I divided the world into a triangle for law enforcement for cyber. We've probably got 20 to 30 countries within that triangle at the top who've got good capability, good capacity. They can investigate cybercrime, but actually they can't talk to each other. Geopolitics now comes into this. And that brings me into the point about Interpol. We're a neutral organization. 196 countries. We can't be involved in anything that's political, military, racist, or religious. We can only deal with crime. Now, in terms of cybercrime, that's perfect, because we want to go after the criminals. It doesn't matter who the threat actor is, they take advantage of vulnerabilities in systems and networks. So move that to one side, the politics, look at the vulnerabilities in the systems and networks. How can we effectively make a program work? Well, we do it in 4 ways: prevention, detection, investigation, and disruption. So when we designed out our strategy and implemented our program, we've boxed it into 4 different areas. When I left in July, we had something like 84 activities within those 4 areas. I'm going to cover some of those in a minute so you can see what we were doing. But it's really important that we're able to connect the police and share that information and data. So back to my triangle, 20 to 30 countries that have got good capabilities but don't share, don't talk to each other. Middle section of probably about 40 to 50 countries have got some capabilities, but they need some coordination. They need help in coordinating their activities. And then finally at the bottom, you've got about 100 plus countries that don't really have the capability or capacity to carry out effective investigations or disruptions. So Interpol is able to fit into all 3 of those different areas. In the first one, being neutral. When the FBI unsealed an indictment on 3 Iranian cybercriminals, and they're very clear in their language, really clear language here. They're cybercriminals committing offences around the world, but also in their own country. So I write to the director of the FBI and say, "Dear Mr. A, how can we assist you? I see you've identified these people, you've unsealed some indictments on them. Marty and my team is from the Iranian cyber police. We will go to Tehran with that information." I didn't hear back from them. So again, policing in the context of how we work and share that data is really, really important. And Interpol's role is connecting policing for a safer world, looking at crime. So when coming back to the triangle, how do we support those countries? Well, we help them build capabilities and capacity, which we give them for free. 196 countries, all the countries pay a membership fee to be a member of Interpol. We're a resolutions-based organisation, so we put a resolution in about countering and combating cybercrime. We'll put recommendations in. And all of the law enforcement agencies and all the countries that are part of Interpol have signed up to all of those. So we've got some process in the first instance that's done. We then have the people working at Interpol. I had an assistant director from the US, China, South Korea, people from Iran, Germany, Brazil. We have a cyber fusion center in Singapore where we actually bring the private sector in to work directly alongside police. And I'll come into that a little bit more in a moment. But also, we give them the tools. So we provide secure platforms to come onto. I've come from the UK. We had lots of different platforms that we would connect on, share information between our colleagues, but we couldn't use those outside of the UK. At Interpol, we have secure platforms. We have a knowledge exchange database where we can share knowledge and information, but also we have an operational platform now where we can bring those countries on and share operational data sets with them. So that's that sharing of information. But there has to be trust in there. And having been at Interpol for 5 years and probably visited something like 40 plus countries, sometimes I would get from the countries I was visiting, well, you have nefarious actors in Interpol. And I would challenge that. I'd say, what do you mean by nefarious actors? Well, you know, they're from this country. But then I'll go to that country and the other country say, well, you have nefarious actors from that country. No, move on. Our role is to reduce the global impact of cybercrime and protect communities for a safer world. We do not be involved and can't be involved in anything political. So how do we do this then? We do this through a number of different ways. And here's just a simple prevention one. And for those that saw the symbols on the last slide, prevention, detection, investigation, disruption, global, regional, and national, what I've tried to do is put this across to what these different activities were. So here, when we've heard about the different crime threats that are going on, part of our role is to raise awareness, is to share that information out. And we have to do that on a global level through our Interpol channels. And Interpol is a non-executive agency. We can't run an operation. So I had to take my senior investigation officer head off when I went to Interpol and come into more of that coordinator and facilitator role, effectively. So this is a sort of annual event piece that we did around awareness campaigns. We had videos as well, so we'd be able to identify the threats. We'd then come into the regions as well. So Middle East, North Africa, we would make it specific to that region. But also on a national basis, we were going on a national level and make sure the information was available to them. Because again, coming back to those countries at the bottom of the triangle, they wouldn't necessarily have those skills to put that information out into their communities. So that's a global campaign, a regional campaign, and a national campaign. And that sort of is underpinned by Interpol, which is an absolutely phenomenal brand. When we look at branding, everybody's heard of Interpol. But actually, do you know, what does Interpol do? It's a bit sort of mystique. Well, this is some of the things that we do. This is our day-to-day work, is going out into our global communities and sharing that information. We also help coordinate operations. Now, one of the operations that we did recently was around a malware operation. Now, the reason this came about was because we had someone from Brazil heading up our Cyber Fusion Center, and he'd been seconded in. We also had someone from Spain who was heading up our operations. And what we would do, we would take the information from the private sector or from law enforcement and bring that together. What we were able to achieve here is the identification of banking malware that was impacting in Europe, mainly in Spain. And we got Spain and Brazil together onto our platforms, and then the arrests were effective. So that disruption piece was done in Brazil, and we went after the criminals. Because locking criminals up does work, especially cyber criminals, because normally once they're locked up, they don't have access to the internet, to their systems, to their networks effectively. But in terms of how we do that and that judicial outcomes, it's very challenging coming back to those borders side of things. So again, this is where we have to start blurring those borders, making sure that law enforcement is able to work effectively together. Operations Engineer was an international operation, and this is where we went after the infrastructure. So this was a different approach. Again, thanks to our private sector partners, they gave us that data and information. And we don't just take it at face value, we make sure we do those other checks that we need to do effectively. And then we help coordinate the operations between all of those countries. Now this operation is carrying on this year at the moment. There'll be further work going on back in Singapore and around the world with the team. And there'll be some more results on this. But this is looking at how do we disrupt that infrastructure. But we've got to be really careful that we don't disrupt the rest of the infrastructure, which allows us to do our day-to-day business. Because we don't want big sort of scenes of crime tape or police tape around those servers and stopping everybody working effectively. Now, the regional piece and how we work regionally is really important. How do we operate in the regions? Well, in Africa in 2019, we had a meeting in Nairobi, and there were about 12 of us around the table, heads of cybercrime units. And what they said to us is, we need help, we need support. So I managed to go back to the UK government and say, hey, you know what? There's lots of criminals in Africa that are impacting back into our country. We need to invest there. So with their investment, we created the Africa Operations Desk, where we had seconded officials working directly in our regional bureaus in Africa. We had data sets coming in from the private sector. And we put the framework together. In 2022 in Rwanda, we had 40 plus people in a room like this, heads of cyber. And Interpol is very famous for doing lots of training. And law enforcement officials, we love training. On a Friday afternoon, we get a nice certificate, and we can have a cup of tea and celebrate. But what we've changed now is we'll only do training when there's an operational output. So for this, we did the training with the law enforcement and made sure there's an operational output. This Africa Surge 2 is continuing as well. What we've done is we've grown out the teams now. But the resilience side of this is difficult because money talks. The operation and the desk costs about 1.2 million euros per year to run. Now, I'm not giving any away secrets here, but that's the reality for law enforcement. In order for us to operate in this environment, we need that coordination, but also we need the funding. There's lots of other people out there doing the work as well. I've just listed a few here. Certainly in this region, we're looking at building a Middle East desk as well. But what's really interesting in this region is you've got a really strong CERT community, a really strong regional CERT. They've got a center in Oman. So what we're looking to do here is try and draw together law enforcement and the certs together because they have different roles and responsibilities. So part of our role is not just bringing law enforcement together, but it's bringing others together as well, effectively. One I mentioned at the bottom there is the World Economic Forum in 2020, and Dimitri was part of this as well, when we looked at partnerships against cybercrime. So we wrote one of those nice glossy reports and said, oh, we've got to do more. Fast forward 4 years now, Project Atlas has been stood up by the private sector. And what they're doing is they're looking at 4 crime types that we gave them: ransomware, business email compromise, carding forums, and infrastructure. And we're looking at the 4 organized groups behind that, and we're looking at the crossovers. The private sector's doing that. Once we have those crossovers, those are the points we're going to go after. Because what we have to do is make sure we aggregate our resources and aggregate that data and information and turn it into action and intelligence, which we can then action. So coming back to Interpol as that global structure, our role is to blur those borders. Just in August at the United Nations, and probably not many of you have been following this, but I have because I've been leading Interpol's work on it, there's now a new international convention to counter the use of information and communications technology for criminal purposes. It's a long one. But what that means is for law enforcement, it's the first international crime convention over 20 years. And where we worked into that is we said, well, we've got 4 global priorities for law enforcement. First of all, international cooperation has to be in that convention. Tick, it is. Don't duplicate. Use the tools and platforms that are already there. Invest in them, such as Interpol and some of the other regional organizations as well. We're very good at, we have a problem, we'll create something new, but actually some of the stuff's already out there. The third one was reduce the gap between law enforcement in their capabilities and capacity as well, because it is widely ranging across the world. And the last one is involving the private sector in all of this as well. And 3 of Interpol's gateway partners are actually here exhibiting at the moment. So we have Bizone and Polygon, we have Kaspersky and Group IB, we have Fortinet, Palo Alto and others. And what they do is they share that data and information with us. But again, we have to be very careful about how we receive that data, how we then share that data out as well. We have very strict rules of processing data. So it comes back to the old adage, people, process and technology. 3 key elements to any program, anything that we do. And we've heard some great presentations earlier today, and we'll hear some more later, but also yesterday. And this is the theme around this, effectively. But I mentioned it yesterday, it's about creating communities to protect communities. You are all out there in the cyber community. You are all protecting the communities in one way or another. But whilst you're protecting the community that you're protecting, whether it's a customer, whether it's a country, just ask that question. Am I truly protecting a global community? Is there something here that if I speak to someone else in the company, and we know people work in very large companies and sometimes that communication doesn't quite get through, but is there something in here that would help protect my mum? And my mum's recently been subjected to a cyber crime. She's not connected to the internet, but there was a data breach at Southern Water in the UK, and we had my mum put on there as a vulnerable elderly person because she's 90 when we had a water leak. And it was great, they brought water around, she was more than happy. And then 3 months ago, she started getting phone calls, and she couldn't understand why she was getting all these phone calls. And effectively what was happening, the data breach, they looked at the data, they seen she was a vulnerable elderly person, and the cybercriminals started targeting her. So for me, it's about how do I protect my mum? Thank you very much.